My daughter-in-law whispered to the ICU nurse, "Let her rot here, she has no one who cares." I lay motionless in that hospital bed, tubes running from my arms, unable to speak after my heart attack. Veronica thought I was finished, helpless, forgotten. What she didn't know was that I'd spent 35 years as a senior insurance investigator, and I still had more allies than she could imagine. 3 weeks later, I had her evicted from my home with a police escort, court orders, and enough evidence to bury her legally. Now she's locked out of my house forever, and I never had to raise my voice once. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this beautiful world are you listening from today? It means everything to know who's sharing this journey with me. Drop your location in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice served. The steady beep of monitors filled the cardiac wing at Pinewood General Hospital. Each electronic pulse echoed through the sterile corridors like a mechanical heartbeat, marking time for those of us caught between recovery and resignation. I lay in bed for B. My silver hair spread across the starched white pillow like spun moonlight. Oxygen tubes trailing from my nose like delicate lifelines connecting me to a world I wasn't ready to leave. The massive heart attack had struck without warning 3 days after my 70th birthday. One moment I was tending to my rose garden in the early morning mist, the next I was crumpled on the brick pathway, clutching my chest as pain radiated through my body like wildfire. The paramedics said I was lucky to be alive. The cardiologist said my heart had suffered significant damage. My son said nothing at all. But my mind was sharp as the day I'd started my career at Meridian Insurance 45 years ago. Through the partially open door of my private room, I could see the hallway where families gathered in hushed conversations, their faces etched with worry, hope, and sometimes resignation. The antiseptic scent couldn't quite mask the underlying smell of fear and grief that seemed to permeate these walls like old paint. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glow that made even the healthiest visitor look pale and drawn. I'd been here for 6 days now, and in all that time, only one visitor had come to see me, Veronica, my son Daniel's wife of 3 years. The woman who'd swept into our family with her perfectly manicured crimson nails and designer handbags that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She'd arrived at our family gatherings with carefully practiced smiles and a wardrobe that screamed expensive taste on someone else's dime. From the beginning, she'd positioned herself as my devoted daughter-in-law, promising to take such wonderful care of me as I aged, assuring everyone how much she cherished family values and tradition. The same woman who now stood just outside my door, her voice low but carrying clearly through the thin hospital walls like poison seeping through cracks. "She's not going to recover from this one," Veronica said to someone in the hallway, her tone matter-of-fact, clinical. "The doctors said her heart is severely damaged, multiple blockages, extensive tissue death. She's 70 years old, for God's sake. At that age, the body just doesn't bounce back." I recognized the other voice, Nurse Bethany, young and earnest, still learning the delicate balance between medical facts and family dynamics. She'd been kind to me during my stay, always taking an extra moment to adjust my pillows or bring me ice chips when my throat felt parched. "But her vitals have been improving steadily," Bethany said carefully, and I could hear the confusion in her voice. "Dr. Rodriguez seems quite optimistic about her recovery. Her heart rhythm has stabilized, and her oxygen levels are—" "Let her rot here," Veronica cut her off, her voice sharp with barely contained impatience. "She has no one who cares. Daniel's busy with work. You know how demanding corporate law can be, and honestly, it would be easier for everyone if she just stayed here, permanently. These places have long-term care facilities, don't they? She could be comfortable here." The silence that followed felt like thunder building in my chest, drowning out even the steady beep of the heart monitor. I didn't couldn't move much anyway with all the wires and tubes tethering me to various machines. But my eyes found Bethany's through that sliver of open door. Something passed between us in that moment, a current of understanding that needed no words. Not pity, not sympathy, but recognition. She'd heard what I'd heard. And she could see that despite my weakened state, my mind was registering every word. Bethany stepped closer to my doorway, clipboard clutched against her chest, and I saw her glance down at her patient notes, then back at me. Her expression had changed, the polite, professional mask had slipped just enough to reveal genuine concern underneath. She'd worked in this cardiac unit long enough to recognize the difference between a grieving family member and someone calculating their next move. "I'll need to update the patient file," Bethany said quietly, her voice taking on a new quality, more formal, more careful. "And speak with the social worker about discharge planning protocols." "Of course," Veronica replied, and I could practically hear her shrug. "Just keep us informed of any developments." Footsteps clicked away down the polished linoleum, designer heels echoing with purpose and confidence, but Bethany remained, and I could sense her presence even though she'd stepped back from the doorway. Moments later, Veronica appeared in my room like an actress making her entrance, all smiles and synthetic sweetness. She wore a coral blazer I'd never seen before, obviously new and expensive, paired with a silk scarf that I recognized as coming from my own jewelry box, the one I'd inherited from my mother, the one I kept in my bedroom safe. She carried a small bouquet of grocery store carnations, the kind you grab as an afterthought from the bucket near the checkout counter. Wilted around the edges, they looked as artificially cheerful as her smile. "Oh, Dorothy," she cooed, placing one cold, ring-laden hand on my shoulder. Her touch felt calculated, performative. "You look so much better today. The color's absolutely coming back to your cheeks. I was just telling Nurse Bethany how remarkable your recovery has been." I stared at her face, my investigator's mind automatically cataloging every detail. The way her smile didn't reach her eyes, which kept darting toward the door as if timing her exit, the slight tremor in her voice that betrayed nervousness despite her confident words, the way she stood just far enough away to avoid genuine contact while maintaining the appearance of caring devotion. Most telling of all was the way she avoided making direct eye contact for more than a few seconds at a time. She busied herself arranging the sad carnations in the plastic water pitcher by my bedside, her movements sharp and efficient. "Daniel sends his love, of course. He's absolutely swamped at the firm right now. You know how it is with those big corporate mergers. 60-hour weeks, partner meetings, client dinners. He's thinking of you constantly, though. We both are." That was a lie. I knew it with the same certainty I'd once used to spot fraudulent insurance claims. Daniel hadn't called the hospital. Once, I'd asked Bethany to check when she thought I was sleeping. "The house is so quiet without you," Veronica continued, smoothing her designer skirt with practiced gestures. Each movement seemed rehearsed, like she'd stood in front of a mirror, perfecting this performance. "I've been keeping everything in perfect order, naturally, though I must say, it's quite a burden, managing such a large property all by myself. So many rooms, so much upkeep. The garden alone requires constant attention. My property, my house, that my late husband Charles and I had built together 45 years ago on Maple Ridge Drive, with its sweeping oak trees and carefully planned garden beds. The house where I'd raised Daniel, where Charles and I had celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, where I'd planned to live out my remaining years surrounded by memories and the roses Charles had planned. Ted for our 10th anniversary, the house that somehow, in the space of 6 days, had become Veronica's to manage. I thought about the spare key I'd given her 6 months ago, intended only for emergencies. I thought about the power of attorney papers Daniel had asked me to sign just in case, which I'd refused. I thought about the conversation I'd overheard between them last Christmas about how much the property was worth, how prime the location was for development. Bethany stepped into the room then, her movements deliberate and professional. She carried a tablet and wore an expression I recognized from my insurance days, the look of someone gathering information for a case file. "Mrs. Walsh," she said, her voice clear and carrying just far enough, "your vitals look very stable today. Dr. Rodriguez will want to discuss discharge planning very soon. Your heart rhythm has improved dramatically, and your blood work shows excellent progress." Veronica's hand paused on the flower stems, her fingers tightening almost imperceptibly. "Discharge. But surely she needs more specialized care, long-term care." I've already been looking into some very nice facilities. That would be entirely up to Mrs. Walsh and whoever she's designated as her healthcare proxy," Bethany said evenly, consulting her tablet with professional detachment. Veronica blinked, the first crack appearing in her composed facade. "Well, Daniel and I are her family, her only family. We'll decide what's best for her." I let my eyes drift to Bethany deliberately, slowly, making sure she could see the full alertness there, the intelligence that Veronica assumed had been dimmed by age and illness. For just a moment, I allowed my investigator's mind to show through the same sharp focus I'd once used to unravel complex fraud schemes and track down false claims. Bethany caught it immediately. Her slight nod was almost imperceptible, but it told me everything I needed to know. She understood. "Of course," Bethany said, her tone remaining neutral. "We'll need to review all the official documentation on file to ensure we're following proper protocols." After Veronica left, humming under her breath the way she always did when she thought she'd accomplished something, Bethany moved quietly around my room, checking monitors and adjusting settings. But I could sense her waiting, giving us both time to process what had just happened. Finally, she gently closed the door. The room fell quiet except for the familiar sounds of the machines monitoring my recovery and the distant murmur of hospital life continuing around us. Through the window, I could see the parking lot where Veronica's red BMW sat gleaming in the afternoon sun, a car that had appeared in her driveway shortly after she'd married Daniel, though neither of them had ever explained how they'd afforded it on his junior associate salary. I looked up at Bethany, and for the first time in days, I managed to speak. My voice came out hoarse and barely audible, weakened by days of intubation and medication, but the words were clear enough. 35 years, I whispered. Bethany leaned closer, her expression encouraging. "Mom, insurance investigator. 35 years. I paused, gathering strength from somewhere deep inside, the same place I'd drawn from during all those long nights poring over case files and following paper trails that others had given up on. Fraud detection specialist, senior level. Bethany's eyes widened slightly, and I saw understanding dawn across her features. Financial crimes, elder abuse, insurance fraud. Each word came easier now, as if speaking my credentials aloud was recharging some essential part of me. I built cases that put people in prison. I tracked money through offshore accounts and shell companies. I testified in federal court. I smiled then, just the corner of my mouth lifting in an expression Veronica would have found very familiar if she'd been paying attention during family dinners when Charles and I shared stories from our careers. She picked the wrong old lady to underestimate. Bethany reached for her phone with careful, deliberate movements. "Mrs. Walsh, would you like me to make a call for you?" I closed my eyes briefly. Not from exhaustion but from the flood of memories washing over me. 35 years of building cases, following leads, uncovering truths that people thought they'd buried deep enough to never surface. I thought of my contacts throughout the legal system, law enforcement, social services, and the insurance industry. I thought of my former colleagues who'd moved on to private investigation firms, elder law practices, and financial crimes units. I thought about my files at home, the ones I'd kept even after retirement. The network diagrams and resource lists I'd maintained because old habits die hard, and you never know when a sharp mind might end. Each sharp tools. Most of all, I thought about my safe deposit box at First National Bank, where I'd kept copies of every important document related to my property, my finances, and my estate planning. The box that only I had access to, despite Daniel's subtle suggestions over the years that I should add him to the access list. Veronica thought I had no one who cared, no one who would fight for me. She was about to learn just how spectacularly wrong she was. "Yes," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I'd like to make several calls, starting with my former supervisor at Meridian Insurance, then my attorney, then my good friend Detective Linda Martinez at the Pinewood Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit." Bethany's smile was small but fierce. "I'll get you a phone. And Mrs. Walsh, for what it's worth, I'm documenting everything that happened today. Timestamps, direct quotes, witness observations. It's all going in your medical file." As she moved toward the door, I called her name softly. Bethany. She turned back. In my experience, people who think they're smart enough to exploit the vulnerable always make the same mistake. They assume no one is watching, no one is listening, and no one will remember. I paused, feeling strength flowing back into my voice like water filling a reservoir. But someone is always watching, someone is always listening. And I never forget anything. The afternoon sun slanted through my hospital window, casting long shadows across the polished floor. In that golden light, I began to plan my first moves. In what would become the most personal case of my career, Veronica had made her fatal error. She'd revealed her true intentions while assuming her victim was helpless. But I wasn't her victim. I was Dorothy Walsh, and I was about to remind that would be entirely up to Mrs. Walsh and whoever she's designated as her healthcare proxy, Bethany said evenly, consulting her tablet with professional detachment. Veronica blinked. The first crack appearing in her composed facade. Well, Daniel and I are her family, her only family. We'll decide what's best for her. I let my eyes drift to Bethany deliberately, slowly, making sure she could see the full alertness there, the intelligence that Veronica assumed had been dimmed by age and illness. For just a moment, I allowed my investigator's mind to show through the same sharp focus I'd once used to unravel complex fraud schemes and track down false claims. Bethany caught it immediately. Her slight nod was almost imperceptible. But it told me everything I needed to know. She understood. Of course, Bethany said, her tone remaining neutral. We'll need to review all the official documentation on file to ensure we're following proper protocols. After Veronica left humming under her breath the way she always did when she thought she'd accomplished something, Bethany moved quietly around my room, checking monitors and adjusting settings. But I could sense her waiting, giving us both time to process what had just happened. Finally, she gently closed the door. The room fell quiet except for the familiar sounds of the machines monitoring my recovery and the distant murmur of hospital life continuing around us, through the window. I could see the parking lot where Veronica's red BMW sat gleaming in the afternoon sun, a car that had appeared in her driveway shortly after she'd married Daniel, though neither of them had ever explained how they'd afforded it on his junior associate salary. I looked up at Bethany, and for the first time in days, I managed to speak. My voice came out hoarse and barely audible, weakened by days of intubation and medication, but the words were clear enough. 35 years, I whispered. Bethany leaned closer, her expression encouraging. Mom, insurance investigator. 35 years. I paused, gathering strength from somewhere deep inside, the same place I'd drawn from during all those long nights poring over case files and following paper trails that others had given up on. Fraud detection specialist, senior level. Bethany's eyes widened slightly, and I saw understanding dawn across her features. Financial crimes, elder abuse, insurance fraud. Each word came easier now, as if speaking my credentials aloud was recharging some essential part of me. I built cases that put people in prison. I tracked money through offshore accounts and shell companies. I testified in federal court. I smiled then, just the corner of my mouth lifting in an expression Veronica would have found very familiar if she'd been paying attention during family dinners when Charles and I shared stories from our careers. She picked the wrong old lady to underestimate. Bethany reached for her phone with careful, deliberate movements. Mrs. Walsh, would you like me to make a call for you? I closed my eyes briefly. Not from exhaustion but from the flood of memories washing over me. 35 years of building cases, following leads, uncovering truths that people thought they'd buried deep enough to never surface. I thought of my contacts throughout the legal system. Law enforcement, social services, and the insurance industry. I thought of my former colleagues who'd moved on to private investigation firms, elder law practices, and financial crimes units. I thought about my files at home, the ones I'd kept even after retirement. The network diagrams and resource lists I'd maintained because old habits die hard, and you never know when a sharp mind might end. Each sharp tools. Most of all, I thought about my safe deposit box at First National Bank, where I'd kept copies of every important document related to my property, my finances, and my estate planning. The box that only I had access to, despite Daniel's subtle suggestions over the years that I should add him to the access list. Veronica thought I had no one who cared. No one who would fight for me. She was about to learn just how spectacularly wrong she was. Yes, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. I'd like to make several calls, starting with my former Sunset Manor. I knew that place. 3 years ago, I'd investigated a case involving financial exploitation at that exact facility. Residents were being systematically overcharged for services, and family members were being pressured to sign over power of attorney to the facility's administrators. The case had resulted in criminal charges and a complete management overhaul. The irony wasn't lost on me. Let's see how she's doing first, Daniel said, and I heard them move toward my door. I quickly closed my eyes and regulated my breathing, letting my body go limp in the practiced way I'd learned during surveillance operations when staying motionless for hours was necessary. Through barely open eyelids, I watched them enter my room. Daniel looked older than his 35 years, stress lines etched around his eyes and mouth. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his suit impeccable, but there was something hollow about his appearance, as if success was wearing him down rather than building him up. When had he started looking so much like a stranger? Veronica, on the other hand, looked radiant. Her blonde hair was freshly highlighted, her makeup flawless, her jewelry expensive and tasteful. She wore a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, paired with shoes that clicked like tiny hammers against the hospital floor. Mom? Daniel approached my bedside cautiously, as if he wasn't sure what he'd find. How are you feeling today? I let my eyes flutter open slowly, as if awakening from deep sleep. Daniel, I said softly, allowing my voice to sound weaker than I felt. You came. Relief flooded his features. Of course I came. I'm sorry it took me so long to get here. Work has been demanding. I finished for him. I understand. Veronica moved to the other side of my bed, her smile bright and practiced. We've been so worried about you, Dorothy. When Daniel told me what happened, I was just beside myself. Thank goodness for neighbors who called the ambulance. Interesting. She was already rewriting the narrative. Mrs. Henderson from next door had indeed called 911 after seeing me collapse in the garden. But Veronica hadn't seemed beside herself when she'd first visited. She'd seemed calculating. The doctors say you're recovering well, Daniel continued, reaching out to awkwardly pat my hand. His touch was brief, perfunctory. But Veronica and I have been talking about what happens next, about making sure you're safe. Here it comes, I thought. We think it might be time to consider some changes, Veronica said gently, perching on the edge of the visitor's chair like a bird ready to take flight. That house is so big, so isolated. What if something happens again and no one's there to help? We've looked into some really nice places, Daniel added, and I could hear him warming to the idea as he spoke. Facilities with full medical staff, activities, other people your age. You wouldn't have to worry about maintaining the house or the garden anymore. And think of the peace of mind, Veronica chimed in, knowing that trained professionals are there 24/7, that you'd never be alone, that everything would be taken care of for you. I let silence stretch between us, watching their faces as they waited for my response. Daniel looked hopeful but nervous. Veronica looked expectant, as if this was merely a formality before moving forward with plans already set in motion. What about my house? I asked finally. Daniel and Veronica exchanged a quick glance so fast that someone without my training might have missed it. Well, Daniel said carefully, we'd need to sell it. Obviously, but the proceeds would go toward Sunset Manor. I knew that place. 3 years ago, I'd investigated a case involving financial exploitation at that exact facility. Residents were being systematically overcharged for services, and family members were being pressured to sign over power of attorney to the facility's administrators. The case had resulted in criminal charges and a complete management overhaul. The irony wasn't lost on me. Let's see how she's doing first, Daniel said, and I heard them move toward my door. I quickly closed my eyes and regulated my breathing, letting my body go limp in the practiced way I'd learned during surveillance operations when staying motionless for hours was necessary. Through barely open eyelids, I watched them enter my room. Daniel looked older than his 35 years, stress lines etched around his eyes and mouth. His dark hair was perfectly styled. His suit impeccable, but there was something hollow about his appearance, as if success was wearing him down rather than building him up. When had he started looking so much like a stranger? Veronica, on the other hand, looked radiant. Her blonde hair was freshly highlighted, her makeup flawless, her jewelry expensive and tasteful. She wore a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, paired with shoes that clicked like tiny hammers against the hospital floor. "Mom?" Daniel approached my bedside cautiously, as if he wasn't sure what he'd find. "How are you feeling today?" I let my eyes flutter open slowly, as if awakening from deep sleep. "Daniel," I said softly, allowing my voice to sound weaker than I felt. "You came." Relief flooded his features. "Of course I came. I'm sorry it took me so long to get here. Work has been demanding." I finished for him. "I understand." Veronica moved to the other side of my bed, her smile bright and practiced. "We've been so worried about you, Dorothy." When Daniel told me what happened, I was just beside myself. Thank goodness for neighbors who called the ambulance. Interesting. She was already rewriting the narrative. Mrs. Henderson from next door had indeed called 911 after seeing me collapse in the garden. But Veronica hadn't seemed beside herself when she'd first visited. She'd seemed calculating. "The doctors say you're recovering well," Daniel continued, reaching out to awkwardly pat my hand. His touch was brief, perfunctory. "But Veronica and I have been talking about what happens next, about making sure you're safe. Here it comes," I thought. "We think it might be time to consider some changes," Veronica said gently, perching on the edge of the visitor's chair like a bird ready to take flight. "That house is so big, so isolated. What if something happens again and no one's there to help? We've looked into some really nice places," Daniel added, and I could hear him warming to the idea as he spoke. "Facilities with full medical staff, activities, other people your age. You wouldn't have to worry about maintaining the house or the garden anymore. And think of the peace of mind," Veronica chimed in, "knowing that trained professionals are there 24/7, that you'd never be alone. That everything would be taken care of for you." I let silence stretch between us, watching their faces as they waited for my response. Daniel looked hopeful but nervous. Veronica looked expectant, as if this was merely a formality before moving forward with plans already set in motion. "What about my house?" I asked finally. Daniel and Veronica exchanged a quick glance so fast that someone without my training might have missed it. "Well," Daniel said carefully, "we'd need to sell it. Obviously. But the proceeds would go toward your care. Make sure you have everything you need. Veronica's already spoken to a realtor about getting an appraisal." Already spoken to a realtor, without consulting me, while I was fighting for my life in a hospital bed. "The market is very strong right now," Veronica added helpfully. "Properties in your neighborhood are selling quickly and for excellent prices. Really, it's the perfect time." "Perfect for whom?" I wondered. "I see," I said quietly. "And what if I don't want to sell?" Another glance between them, this one longer and more pointed. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he'd developed over the past few years, "you have to be realistic. You can't live alone anymore. Not safely. And that house is too much for you to handle." "It's too much for anyone to handle alone," Veronica agreed. "The maintenance, the upkeep, the yard work. It's overwhelming even for someone in perfect health." She was wrong about that. Charles and I had designed the house to be manageable, with low-maintenance landscaping and updated systems. The only reason it might seem overwhelming was if someone was deliberately letting things slide. "Have you been maintaining it while I've been here?" I asked Veronica directly. "Of course," she said quickly. "Though I have to admit, there are some issues that need attention. The basement has been making strange noises, and I think there might be a problem with the furnace. And the garden, well, without your expert touch, things are starting to look a bit wild." More lies. I'd had the furnace serviced just 3 months ago. And my garden was designed to be largely self-sustaining. If things were looking wild, it was because someone wasn't bothering with basic maintenance or wanted to create problems that would support their narrative. I appreciate your concern, I said carefully, but I think I'd like to go home and see for myself how things are before making any major decisions. Daniel's face fell. Mom, the doctors haven't even cleared you for discharge yet, but when they do, I pressed gently, I'd like to go home, at least for a while. Veronica's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, Dorothy. Though I do think you should consider having someone stay with you, at least initially. For safety. That's very thoughtful, I replied. I'll certainly consider it. We talked for another 20 minutes. No, dear. But the truck didn't have any charity markings on it, just a regular moving truck. After I hung up, I stared at the ceiling and felt something I hadn't experienced in decades of investigating fraud cases. Personal rage. Veronica wasn't just planning to exploit me. She was already doing it. While I lay in a hospital bed fighting for my life, she was systematically looting my home and preparing to sell my property out from under me. But she'd made a critical error. She'd assumed that a 70-year-old woman recovering from a heart attack would be too weak, too confused, too grateful for help to ask questions or check up on things. She'd never dealt with a professional investigator before. I reached for the phone again. This time, I called Detective Martinez directly. Linda, I said when she answered, we need to move faster than we discussed. They're not waiting for me to be declared incompetent. They're already treating me as if I am. What's happened? I told her about the boxes, the furniture, the unauthorized access to my home. I told her about the conversation I'd overheard and the pressure to sell my house and move to a facility with a history of exploitation. Dorothy, Linda said when I finished, this isn't just elder abuse anymore. This is theft, potentially grand larceny, depending on the value of what's been taken. And if they're using your incapacitation to justify these actions, we might be looking at exploitation charges as well. What do we need to prove it? Evidence, documentation, witnesses. And we need to establish that you're competent to make your own decisions about your property and care. I can provide all of that. I know you can. But Dorothy, we're going to have to be very careful about how we proceed. If they realize you're onto— No, dear. But the truck didn't have any charity markings on it, just a regular moving truck. After I hung up, I stared at the ceiling and felt something I hadn't experienced in decades of investigating fraud cases. Personal rage. Veronica wasn't just planning to exploit me. She was already doing it. While I lay in a hospital bed fighting for my life, she was systematically looting my home and preparing to sell my property out from under me. But she'd made a critical error. She'd assumed that a 70-year-old woman recovering from a heart attack would be too weak, too confused, too grateful for help to ask questions or check up on things. She'd never dealt with a professional investigator before. I reached for the phone again. This time, I called Detective Martinez directly. Linda, I said when she answered, we need to move faster than we discussed. They're not waiting for me to be declared incompetent. They're already treating me as if I am. What's happened? I told her about the boxes, the furniture, the unauthorized access to my home. I told her about the conversation I'd overheard and the pressure to sell my house and move to a facility with a history of exploitation. Dorothy, Linda said when I finished, this isn't just elder abuse anymore. This is theft, potentially grand larceny, depending on the value of what's been taken. And if they're using your incapacitation to justify these actions, we might be looking at exploitation charges as well. What do we need to prove it? Evidence, documentation, witnesses. And we need to establish that you're competent to make your own decisions about your property and care. I can provide all of that. I know you can. But Dorothy, we're going to have to be very careful about how we proceed. If they realize you're onto them, they might accelerate their timeline. Or worse, they might take steps to have you declared incompetent before you can protect yourself. I thought about Daniel's quick agreement with Veronica's suggestions, his relief at the prospect of selling my house, my own son, willing to hand over my autonomy to a woman who'd been systematically deceiving our family. Linda, I said, I spent 35 years building cases against people who thought they were smarter than the system. I'm not about to let them win this one. I know. But this is personal for you in a way your other cases never were. Don't let anger cloud your judgment. She was right, of course. But she was also underestimating something important. This wasn't just personal anymore. This was professional. And I'd never lost a case when both were on the line. As evening settled over Pinewood General, I lay in my hospital bed and began to plan my counterattack. Veronica thought she was dealing with a helpless old woman. She was about to discover that some old women had spent their careers hunting predators exactly like her. The game was about to change, and this time, I was going to be the one setting the rules. Thursday morning brought unexpected visitors to Pinewood General. I was just finishing my breakfast, real food now, not the liquid diet they'd started me on, when I heard voices in the hallway that made my blood freeze. Told you this would be the perfect time, a woman's voice was saying. Not Veronica. Someone older, more authoritative, while she's incapacitated and can't interfere with the process. I still think we should wait until she's discharged, came another voice I didn't recognize. Male, nervous. It feels wrong doing this while she's in the hospital. Nonsense. The first woman replied sharply, the longer we wait, the more complicated this becomes. She could recover more than expected, start asking questions, cause problems. We need to move. No, dear. But the truck didn't have any charity markings on it, just a regular moving truck. After I hung up, I stared at the ceiling and felt something I hadn't experienced in decades of investigating fraud cases. Personal rage. Veronica wasn't just planning to exploit me. She was already doing it. While I lay in a hospital bed fighting for my life, she was systematically looting my home and preparing to sell my property out from under me. But she'd made a critical error. She'd assumed that a 70-year-old woman recovering from a heart attack would be too weak, too confused, too grateful for help to ask questions or check up on things. She'd never dealt with a professional investigator before. I reached for the phone again. This time, I called Detective Martinez directly. Linda, I said when she answered, we need to move faster than we discussed. They're not waiting for me to be declared incompetent. They're already treating me as if I am. What's happened? I told her about the boxes, the furniture, the unauthorized access to my home. I told her about the conversation I'd overheard and the pressure to sell my house and move to a facility with a history of exploitation. Dorothy, Linda said when I finished, this isn't just elder abuse anymore. This is theft, potentially grand larceny, depending on the value of what's been taken. And if they're using your incapacitation to justify these actions, we might be looking at exploitation charges as well. What do we need to prove it? Evidence, documentation, witnesses. And we need to establish that you're competent to make your own decisions about your property and care. I can provide all of that. I know you can. But Dorothy, we're going to have to be very careful about how we proceed. If they realize you're onto them, they might accelerate their timeline. Or worse, they might take steps to have you declared incompetent before you can protect yourself. I thought about Daniel's quick agreement with Veronica's suggestions, his relief at the prospect of selling my house, my own son, willing to hand over my autonomy to a woman who'd been systematically deceiving our family. Linda, I said, I spent 35 years building cases against people who thought they were smarter than the system. I'm not about to let them win this one. I know. But this is personal for you in a way your other cases never were. Don't let anger cloud your judgment. She was right, of course. But she was also underestimating something important. This wasn't just personal anymore. This was professional. And I'd never lost a case when both were on the line. As evening settled over Pinewood General, I lay in my hospital bed and began to plan my counterattack. Veronica thought she was dealing with a helpless old woman. She was about to discover that some old women had spent their careers hunting predators exactly like her. The game was about to change, and this time, I was going to be the one setting the rules. Thursday morning brought unexpected visitors to Pinewood General. I was just finishing my breakfast, real food now, not the liquid diet they'd started me on, when I heard voices in the hallway that made my blood freeze. Told you this would be the perfect time, a woman's voice was saying. Not Veronica. Someone older, more authoritative, while she's incapacitated and can't interfere with the process. I still think we should wait until she's discharged, came another voice I didn't recognize. Male, nervous. It feels wrong doing this while she's in the hospital. Nonsense. The first woman replied sharply, the longer we wait, the more complicated this becomes. She could recover more than expected, start asking questions, cause problems. We need to move now while we have legal justification. I set down my coffee cup with shaking hands and reached for the call button, but before I could press it, Bethany appeared in my doorway. Her face was pale, and she was clutching her tablet like a shield. Mrs. Walsh, she said quietly, there are some people here to see you. They say they're from Elder Services, and they have some paperwork they need you to review. Elder Services. My stomach dropped like a stone. I'm sorry, I said carefully, but I've never called you at 3 in the morning about a break-in. And I've never accused Mrs. Henderson of stealing my mail. See, Veronica said, turning to Sandra with a pained expression. This is exactly what I've been dealing with. She doesn't remember things that happened, or she remembers them completely differently than they actually occurred. Sandra made a note on her tablet. Mrs. Walsh, do you remember having any conversations with your daughter-in-law about safety concerns in your home? It was a trap, beautifully constructed. If I said yes, I was admitting to the conversations Veronica had fabricated. If I said no, I was appearing to have memory problems. I remember every conversation I've had with Veronica, I said calmly, including the one 2 days ago when she and my son pressured me to sell my house and move to a care facility, despite the fact that my doctors say I'm recovering well and should be able to return home soon. The young man with the tablet looked up sharply. You're planning to return home alone, that's the problem, Veronica interjected quickly. She insists she can live independently. But she's already had one serious medical emergency. What if it happens again? What if no one finds her in time? What if it happens to anyone? I countered. Should every person who's had a heart attack be automatically declared incompetent to live in their own home? Sandra cleared her throat. Mrs. Walsh, we're not here to declare anyone incompetent. We're here to assess whether you need protective services and support systems to ensure your safety and well-being. I appreciate that, I said, but I'm curious about something. Who exactly filed the report that brought you here? Veronica and Sandra exchanged a glance that lasted just a fraction too long. Reports can come from various sources, Sandra said diplomatically. Family members, neighbors, medical professionals. Anyone who has legitimate concerns about an elder's welfare. But in this specific case, who filed the report? Another pause. Then Sandra consulted her tablet. The initial report was filed by Mrs. Veronica Walsh, listing herself as your primary caregiver and expressing concerns about your safety and cognitive function. Primary caregiver. I let that phrase hang in the air for a moment. Ms. Kellerman, I said, I'd like to clarify something. Veronica is not my primary caregiver. She's my daughter-in-law, and until 6 days ago when I had my heart attack, I was living independently and managing all aspects of my own care. But she has been helping you with daily activities, hasn't she? The young man asked, consulting his notes. Shopping, cleaning, managing your medications? No, I said simply. I do my own shopping. I clean my own house, and I manage my own medications. In fact, Veronica has a key to my house only for emergencies, which I gave her 6 months ago as a precautionary measure. Veronica's face was starting to show strain around the edges. Dorothy, you're forgetting about all the times I've had to come over because you were confused about your medications, or because you'd left the stove on, or when? I interrupted. Give me a specific date when any of those things happened. Well, it's hard to remember exact dates, but I can give you exact dates, I said, looking directly at Sandra. I can tell you every time Veronica has been in my house in the past 6 months, because I keep a detailed calendar. Would you like me to provide those records? Sandra was writing notes rapidly now. Mrs. Walsh, you mentioned keeping detailed records. Are you generally good with paperwork and financial management? I should be, I said. I spent 35 years as a senior insurance investigator, specializing in fraud detection and financial crimes. I'm quite comfortable with documentation and record keeping. The young man looked up from his tablet. You worked in law enforcement, insurance investigation. We worked closely with law enforcement on cases involving fraud, elder abuse, and financial exploitation. I built cases that resulted in criminal prosecutions and civil recoveries. I could see Veronica's face going pale around the edges. This wasn't the confused, helpless old woman she'd described to elder services. In fact, I continued, I'm curious about something, Miss Kellerman. When you investigate reports of elder abuse or exploitation, do you typically interview the alleged victim alone, without the person who filed the report present? Sandra paused in her note-taking. That depends on the circumstances. Because I'd like to point out that everything I'm saying right now is being influenced by the presence of the person who filed the report against me. If I were to contradict her claims or suggest that she might have ulterior motives, she's right here to immediately challenge my statements and reinforce the narrative that I'm confused or paranoid. The room fell silent except for the beeping of my monitors and the distant sounds of hospital activity. Mrs. Walsh, Sandra said finally. Are you suggesting that the report filed against you was inaccurate? I'm suggesting that you might want to investigate the person who filed it before proceeding with any protective interventions, I said calmly. For instance, did you know that Veronica has filed multiple insurance claims over the past few years that were flagged for investigation? Or that she's been removing items from my house without my permission while I've been hospitalized? Or that she's already contacted realtors about selling my property despite having no legal authority to do so? Veronica shot to her feet. This is exactly what I've been talking about. Paranoid accusations, conspiracy theories, completely unfounded claims. She's been saying terrible things about me to anyone who will listen. Then you won't mind if Miss Kellerman verifies those claims, I said evenly. I can provide contact information for Detective Linda Martinez at the Pinewood Police Department, who is currently investigating reports of theft from my property. I can also provide the name and number of my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who witnessed unauthorized persons removing furniture and boxes from my house while I was unconscious in this hospital bed. The young man was scribbling notes frantically now. Sandra had stopped writing altogether and was staring at me with the expression of someone whose routine case had just become much more complicated. Furthermore, I continued, I'd like to point out that the supposed evidence of my incompetence is being presented by someone who stands to benefit financially from having me declared unable to manage my own affairs. Ms. Kellerman, in your experience, isn't that usually a red flag in these types of cases? Veronica's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. Dorothy, how can you say such horrible things? I've done nothing but try to help you. I've sacrificed my own time and energy to make sure you're safe and cared for. By removing my property without permission, by contacting realtors to sell my house while I'm in the hospital, by filing a report to have me declared incompetent 3 days after I suffered a heart attack, before I've even been discharged or given a chance to demonstrate my recovery. I was trying to protect you from what? From living in my own home that I've maintained successfully for 45 years. From managing my own finances that I've handled competently throughout my entire adult life. Or from making decisions about my own care and future. Sandra cleared her throat. Mrs. Walsh, these are serious allegations. If you have evidence to support them, I have extensive evidence, I said. Documentation, witnesses, and a law enforcement investigation already in progress. But more importantly, I have 35 years of professional experience recognizing exactly this type of exploitation scheme. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. Bethany appeared with a woman in a sharp gray suit carrying a briefcase. Mrs. Walsh, Bethany said, your attorney is here. The woman stepped forward confidently. I'm Jennifer Morrison from Pierce & Associates. I represent Mrs. Walsh in all legal matters. Sandra looked bewildered. I wasn't aware that Mrs. Walsh had contacted an attorney. She contacted us yesterday, Jennifer said, setting her briefcase down with a decisive thud. When she became aware that proceedings might be initiated against her while she was medically vulnerable. We've also been in contact with Detective Martinez regarding the theft of Mrs. Walsh's property. Veronica was backing toward the window now, her face flushed and her hands shaking slightly. This is ridiculous. I'm trying to help her and she's turning it into some kind of criminal conspiracy. Then you should welcome a thorough investigation, Jennifer said smoothly. If your motives are purely altruistic, you have nothing to worry about. Sandra closed her tablet with a snap. Mrs. Walsh, I think we need to suspend this evaluation pending further investigation of these claims. This is not a typical elder services case. No, I agreed, it's not. It's an attempted financial exploitation disguised as a welfare check, as Sandra and the young man packed up their materials. Veronica made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Dorothy, she said, tears starting to form in her eyes, I love you like my own mother. How can you believe I would ever hurt you? I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had wormed her way into my family, who had smiled at my dinner table while planning to steal my home, who had tried to have me declared incompetent while I lay recovering from a heart attack. Veronica, I said quietly, in 35 years of investigating fraud cases, I learned that the most dangerous predators are the ones who cry when they're caught. The room fell silent. Then Sandra gathered her briefcase and headed for the door. Mrs. Walsh, she said, pausing at the threshold, I'll be filing a report recommending that this case be transferred to our fraud investigation unit. Someone will be in touch. After they left, Veronica stood alone by the window, still clutching her box of fabricated evidence. Her carefully constructed performance had crumbled, leaving behind something raw and desperate. You've ruined everything, she whispered. No, I said calmly. I've saved everything, including myself. She left without another word, taking her box of lies with her. Jennifer Morrison opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Mrs. Walsh, she said with a smile, I think it's time we discussed filing some charges of our own. As afternoon settled over my hospital room, I realized that the game had fundamentally changed. Veronica had played her strongest card and lost. Now it was my turn to deal. And I intended to make sure she never got another hand. Friday morning marked exactly 1 week since my heart attack, and I woke up feeling more like myself than I had since collapsing in my garden. The medical team had been running tests all week, and the results were better than anyone had expected. My heart was healing, my strength was returning, and most importantly, my discharge was now scheduled for Sunday morning. But while my body was recovering, my mind had been working overtime. Jennifer Morrison had stayed late the previous evening, and together we'd constructed what she called the most comprehensive counter-offensive she'd seen in 20 years of elder law practice. The folder she'd left on my bedside table contained enough documentation to bury Veronica's scheme and potentially send her to prison. The beauty of this case, Jennifer had explained, is that she's committed multiple felonies while trying to prove you're incompetent. The irony is delicious from a legal standpoint. Now, as I sipped my morning coffee and watched the sunrise paint the hospital walls golden, I was putting the finishing touches on my plan. It was time to remind everyone exactly who Dorothy Walsh was, and what happened when someone tried to exploit a woman who'd spent her career catching predators. At 8:30 a.m., Detective Linda Martinez arrived with a younger man I didn't recognize. He was tall, serious-looking, and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to complicated cases. Dorothy, Linda said, settling into the visitor's chair, I'd like you to meet Detective Ray Camden from the Financial Crimes Unit. After everything that happened yesterday, this case has been escalated. Detective Camden pulled out a digital recorder and set it on my bedside table. Mrs. Walsh, I understand you have extensive experience in fraud investigation. I'd like to walk through this case with you, not just as a victim, but as a professional colleague. The request sent a thrill through me that I hadn't felt in years. He wasn't treating me like a confused elderly woman who needed protection. He was treating me like an expert whose insights could help solve a complex case. Where would you like me to start? I asked. Let's begin with your professional background, Camden said. Detective Martinez filled me in on the basics, but I'd like to hear it from you. I settled back against my pillows and felt my mind slip into the familiar rhythm of case presentation. I started at Meridian Insurance in 1988 as a claims investigator. I began. Back then, insurance fraud was considered a relatively minor issue, but I saw patterns that others missed. Small discrepancies that pointed to larger schemes. By 1995, I was heading up the fraud detection unit. By 2000, I was senior investigator for the entire tri-state region. Camden was taking notes rapidly. What kind of cases did you typically handle? Everything from simple billing fraud to complex multi-million-dollar schemes involving offshore accounts and shell companies. But my specialty became elder fraud and family exploitation cases. There's something particularly insidious about crimes that exploit trust and family relationships. How many cases would you estimate you worked over your career directly? Investigated, over 800. Supervised or consulted on, probably double that. I testified in federal court 43 times. And my investigations resulted in over 200 criminal convictions. Linda leaned forward. Dorothy, tell him about the Morrison case. I smiled, remembering one of my most complex investigations. The Morrison case involved a family member who was systematically stealing from his elderly uncle. Classic financial exploitation, but with sophisticated elements. The nephew had managed to gain power of attorney through deception, then used that authority to transfer property, liquidate investments, and even take out loans against the uncle's assets. Camden looked up from his notes. How did you uncover it? Pattern recognition. The nephew's lifestyle didn't match his reported income. Property transfers that benefited him but supposedly came from the uncle's wishes. Medical records that suggested the uncle was far more competent than the nephew claimed. And most importantly, the nephew's behavior when questioned, he assumed that because his uncle was elderly and had some health issues, no one would investigate thoroughly. Sounds familiar? Camden said dryly. The parallels to my own situation are striking, I agreed, but there's one crucial difference. The Morrison uncle was genuinely isolated and vulnerable. I'm not. I pulled out my phone and showed them the screen. 47 missed calls and 32 text messages since yesterday afternoon. Word is spreading through my professional network about what Veronica tried to do. Linda raised an eyebrow. What kind of word? Former colleagues, current law enforcement contacts, insurance industry people who remember my work. When someone tries to exploit a fraud investigator, the community takes it personally. Camden was scrolling through his tablet. Mrs. Walsh, I've been reviewing your daughter-in-law's background. Jennifer Morrison provided us with some interesting information about her previous insurance claims. James Morrison at Meridian Flag. 3 separate claims between 2018 and 2020, I said. Personal injury, property damage, and a suspicious fire. What did your investigation turn up? More than 3 claims. We found 7 separate insurance payouts from 4 different companies over the past 5 years. Total value, approximately $180,000, all just under the threshold that would trigger automatic federal investigation. The number hit me like a physical blow, $180,000. That was more than just opportunistic fraud, that was a systematic operation. What about the property she claimed burned down? Linda asked. Rental property in her name, purchased 6 months before the fire. Insurance investigation was inconclusive, but the payout was substantial. She used the money to buy another property, which she flipped for a significant profit. I was putting pieces together in my mind, the way I'd done thousands of times before. She's not just a family member trying to exploit an elderly relative, she's a professional. This is what she does. Camden nodded grimly. That's our assessment as well. And it gets worse. We've identified at least 2 other elderly individuals in her past who experienced similar family interventions around the time their health declined. Other victims. Her first husband's grandmother, who died in a nursing home after signing over power of attorney to Veronica, and her second husband's uncle, who mysteriously transferred property to her shortly before being placed in memory care. The scope of Veronica's operation was staggering. She wasn't just an opportunistic daughter-in-law, she was a serial predator who specifically targeted elderly family members during medical crises. Detective Camden, I said, in my experience, Predators like this don't stop until they're forced to stop. And they certainly don't stop when their current scheme falls apart. They just move on to the next victim. Which is why we need to stop her now, he agreed. But we need solid evidence of criminal activity. What she's attempted with you is clear, but we need to prove intent and pattern. I smiled. Detective, I spent 35 years building exactly these kinds of cases. I know what evidence you need, and I know how to get it. What do you have in mind? A controlled operation. Let her think she's won something back. Create an opportunity for her to commit another felony while we're watching. Linda looked intrigued. What kind of opportunity? I pulled out a business card that Jennifer Morrison had left with me. My attorney is preparing new power of attorney documents, legitimate ones, properly witnessed and notarized. But we're going to let Veronica know about them, and we're going to give her an opportunity to try to intercept or alter them. Camden was grinning now. Document fraud, federal offense. Exactly. And if she takes the bait, we'll have her on camera committing a crime that removes any doubt about her intentions. Over the next hour, we refined the plan. It was elegant in its simplicity, the kind of operation I'd run dozens of times during my career. We would use Veronica's own greed and desperation against her. There's one more thing, I said as the detectives prepared to leave. I want to be involved in every aspect of this operation, not as a victim, but as a consultant. Camden looked uncertain. Mrs. Walsh, you're still recovering from a serious medical event, and legally, you're the victim in this case, detective. I'm a 70-year-old woman who's been investigating fraud longer than you've been alive. I know Veronica's psychology better than anyone else on your team because I've been studying her for 3 years. You need my expertise. Linda nodded slowly. She's right, Ray. Dorothy's forgotten more about fraud investigation than most of us ever learned. Besides, I added, I have something none of your other cases have had. What's that? Personal motivation. This woman tried to steal my life while I was fighting for it. She manipulated my son, violated my home, and attempted to have me declared incompetent so she could profit from my helplessness. I want to see her in handcuffs. And I want to be the one who puts them on her. Camden was quiet for a long moment. Then he closed his tablet and looked at me directly. Mrs. Walsh, in 15 years of financial crimes investigation, I've never had a victim with your qualifications offer to assist with their own case. If you're willing to work with us not as a victim, but as a consultant, I think we can build something special here. Something that will put her away for a very long time, I said, and send a message to every other predator who thinks elderly victims are easy targets, Linda added. After they left, I sat in my hospital bed and felt something I hadn't experienced since my retirement, the electric anticipation of a case about to break wide open. For 5 years, I'd been a retired investigator, a former professional living quietly in my garden and my memories. But Veronica had made a critical error. She'd awakened something in me that had never really gone to sleep. At noon, Bethany brought me a visitor I wasn't expecting, Mrs. Henderson from next door. She was clutching a manila envelope and looking both nervous and determined. Dorothy, dear, she said, settling carefully into the visitor's chair, I hope you don't mind me coming, but I have something I think you need to see. She opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of photographs. After we talked yesterday, I remembered that my grandson installed one of those security cameras by my front door last Christmas. The kind that records motion. My heart started beating faster. Mrs. Henderson, please tell me you have recordings of Veronica's activities at my house. 3 days worth, she said proudly. Including the night she had those men remove your furniture, and something else I didn't mention. Yesterday, she handed me a photograph that made my blood run cold. It showed Veronica standing in my front doorway, holding a set of keys, while a man in coveralls worked on my front door lock. She had your locks changed, Dorothy, Tuesday night. While you were unconscious in this hospital, she told the locksmith that you'd asked her to upgrade your security after the break-in. What break-in? Exactly what I wondered. So I asked her about it, and she said you'd been having problems with someone trying to get into your house. That you were too embarrassed to tell anyone about it because you thought people would think you We're imagining things, another lie. Expertly constructed, Veronica had created a fictional break-in to justify changing my locks, effectively locking me out of my own home while giving herself complete access. Mrs. Henderson, I said, you may have just provided the final piece of evidence we need to put Veronica in prison. Her eyes went wide. Prison? She's not just a concerned daughter-in-law, Mrs. Henderson. She's a professional criminal who specializes in exploiting elderly people during medical crises. What you've documented could be the key to stopping her. I immediately called Detective Camden, who arrived within 30 minutes accompanied by a crime scene technician. Mrs. Henderson's security footage was even more damning than I'd hoped. This is beautiful, Camden said, watching the footage on his laptop. Clear shots of her face, clear shots of the unauthorized lock change, clear shots of the furniture removal. And the timestamp shows it all happened while you were unconscious. In the ICU, what about the men helping her? I asked. We'll identify them from the footage. But Mrs. Walsh, this gives us everything we need for breaking and entering, theft, and criminal trespass charges, combined with the elder abuse and fraud charges from her other activities. We're looking at serious prison time. The crime scene. Technician looked up from his equipment. Detective, there's something else here. The footage shows her making multiple trips into the house with empty boxes and coming out with full ones. If we can inventory what was taken and establish value, we might be looking at grand larceny charges. I thought about my grandmother's desk, my family photographs, the backup financial documents I'd kept in that locked drawer. How much of my life had Veronica stolen while I fought for my survival? There's one more thing, Mrs. Henderson said quietly. The footage shows her doing something odd in your garden. Camden pulled up a different segment of video. In it, Veronica was kneeling by my rose bushes, appearing to dig something up from the soil. What was she doing? The technician asked. I stared at the screen, and suddenly I understood. She was planting evidence, I said. Something to support her claim that I was confused or paranoid. Something she could discover later to prove I was hiding things or behaving irrationally. Camden paused the video. You think she buried something in your garden to make you look incompetent? It's exactly what a professional fraud artist would do. Create evidence to support the narrative, then find it at the perfect moment to justify intervention. We spent another hour going through the footage, documenting every illegal action Veronica had taken. By the time Camden and his team left, we had enough evidence to arrest her immediately. But I had a better idea. Detective, I said as he packed up his equipment. I want to catch her in the act of one more crime, something that removes any possible doubt about her intentions. What did you have in mind? She thinks she's won control of my property by changing the locks and filing that elder services report. But she doesn't know about the security footage, and she doesn't know that I'm planning to go home on Sunday. Camden was grinning again. You want to catch her in your house when she thinks you can't get in. Exactly. Let her commit one more burglary while we're watching. So there's absolutely no question about her criminal intent, Mrs. Walsh, he said, shaking his head in admiration. You're diabolical. Detective, I replied, I didn't spend 35 years catching criminals by being nice to them. As evening fell over Pinewood General, I felt like myself for the first time in a week. Not like a victim, not like a patient, but like the professional investigator I'd been for most of my adult life. Veronica thought she'd found an easy mark in a confused old woman recovering from a heart attack. She was about to learn that some old women had spent their careers making sure predators like her ended up in prison. And I was very good at my job. Saturday morning brought an unexpected flurry of activity to my hospital room. Word had spread through my professional network faster than I'd anticipated, and apparently, attempting to defraud a respected former colleague was considered a personal insult to the entire fraud investigation commune. The first surprise visitor arrived at 7 a.m., just as I was finishing breakfast. Marcus Rodriguez, former FBI special agent and current director of the National Elder Fraud Task Force, knocked on my door frame with the confidence of someone who'd been tracking down white-collar criminals for 30 years. Dorothy Walsh, he said with a grin, when I heard someone was stupid enough to try running a con on you, I had to see this for myself. Marcus and I had worked together on several high-profile cases during the late 1990s. When insurance fraud was starting to intersect with federal crimes involving wire transfers and interstate commerce, he was one of the sharpest investigators I'd ever met, and seeing him now reminded me just how extensive my professional network really was. "Marcus," I said, genuinely pleased to see him. I wasn't expecting federal interest in a local elder abuse case. "Oh, but it's not just local anymore," he said, settling into the visitor's chair and pulling out his tablet. "Veronica Walsh, née Hartwell, has been very busy over the past 5 years. When Detective Camden ran her information through our databases yesterday, we found some interesting connections." He showed me his screen, which displayed a complex web diagram with Veronica's photo at the center and dozens of connected nodes radiating outward. "She's been operating across state lines," Marcus continued. "The rental property fire was in Delaware. One of her previous victims lived in Maryland. Another was in Pennsylvania. Once fraud crosses state boundaries, it becomes our jurisdiction." I studied the diagram, my investigator's mind automatically categorizing the connections. "How many victims are we talking about?" "At least 6 that we can confirm, possibly more. The pattern is consistent. She marries into families or establishes long-term relationships with elderly individuals, waits for a medical crisis or period of vulnerability, then systematically exploits their assets while positioning herself as their primary caregiver." "What's the total financial damage?" Marcus scrolled through his data. "Conservative estimate, over $500,000. But Dorothy, that's not even the worst part." After I hung up, Marcus was practically beaming. "Dorothy, your son just gave us probable cause and premeditation. That call was essentially a conspiracy to commit burglary. He coordinated the timing to ensure Veronica would have unsupervised access to your house." Victoria added, "That's criminal conspiracy, and it demonstrates that he's been actively participating in her schemes." I felt a mixture of sadness and anger. My son, the child I'd raised, educated, and supported through law school, had just helped plan a burglary of my own home. "Mrs. Walsh," Marcus said gently, "I know this is painful, but you've just provided us with evidence that will ensure both of them face appropriate consequences for their actions." "Good," I said firmly. "If my son has chosen to participate in elder exploitation, then he deserves whatever happens to him." The rest of the afternoon was spent finalizing details. Surveillance teams would be positioned around my house by noon tomorrow. The house would be equipped with additional hidden cameras. The bait documents would be placed strategically where Veronica would be likely to find them. "One last thing," Victoria said as they prepared to leave. "Are you prepared for the possibility that tomorrow's operation might result in Veronica being arrested at your house?" "I've been preparing for that possibility since Thursday," I said. "In fact, I'm looking forward to it." Marcus shook his head in admiration. "Dorothy, in 20 years of federal law enforcement, I've never worked with a victim who was better prepared to prosecute their own case." "That's because most victims aren't former fraud investigators," I replied. Veronica picked the wrong target. As evening settled over the hospital, I made one final call to Detective Linda Martinez. "Linda," I said when she answered, "everything's set for tomorrow. But I need to ask you something." "What's that?" "When they arrest her, I want to be the one who reads her rights." Linda was quiet for a moment. "Dorothy, that's not standard protocol, I know. But Linda, I spent 35 years putting criminals in handcuffs. This one tried to steal my life while I was fighting for it. I want her to see my face when she realizes how badly she miscalculated. I'll talk to Camden and the federal team. No promises, but given your professional background and the circumstances." "Thank you." That night, as I lay in my hospital bed for the last time, I thought about the past week. 7 days ago, I'd been a retired woman tending her garden. Tomorrow, I would be a key witness in a federal prosecution that could change how elder exploitation cases were handled nationwide. Veronica had intended to make me a victim. Instead, she'd reminded me who I really was, and tomorrow, she was going to learn exactly what happened when someone tried to con a professional investigator. I fell asleep with a smile on my face, already anticipating the look on her face when the handcuffs clicked shut. Sunday morning arrived crisp and clear. The kind of October day that made everything seem possible. As I waited for my discharge paperwork, I watched through my hospital window as surveillance teams took their positions around the neighborhood. An unmarked van posed as a utility repair truck. 2 agents in joggers' clothing began their morning run through the area. A woman with a small dog settled onto a bench across from my house with a perfect view of the front door. The operation was already in motion. Dr. Rodriguez appeared at 9 a.m. with my discharge papers and a genuine smile. Mrs. Walsh, in 40 years of cardiology, I've rarely seen a recovery quite like yours. Your heart function has improved dramatically, your stamina is returning, and frankly, you seem more energetic now than when you arrived. Fighting for your life tends to clarify priorities, I said, signing the final forms. Indeed, but I have to ask, are you certain you're ready to return home? The social worker mentioned there had been some family complications. I smiled. Doctor, those complications are about to be resolved permanently. At 10:30 a.m., my aide arrived. Agent Sarah Chen was a 20-year FBI veteran who specialized in undercover operations. To anyone watching, she appeared to be exactly what she claimed, a professional home health worker in scrubs, carrying a medical bag and projecting the competent, caring manner of someone accustomed to helping elderly patients. Mrs. Walsh, she said in character, settling me into the wheelchair for transport. I understand you have a follow-up appointment this afternoon. That will give me time to assess your home environment and make sure everything is set up for your recovery. The ride home felt surreal. After a week in the hospital, my neighborhood looked almost far. The autumn leaves had deepened to brilliant reds and golds, and my house sat quietly among the maple trees, looking exactly like the peaceful home I'd left behind, not the crime scene it had become. As we pulled into my driveway, I could see Mrs. Henderson watching from her front window. She raised her hand in a small wave, and I knew she was ready to play her part as a witness if needed. The security camera she'd installed had already provided crucial evidence, and now she was positioned to observe everything that happened today. Agent Chen helped me inside, maintaining her cover while quickly scanning for the surveillance equipment that had been installed during the night. Everything was in place, cameras hidden in smoke detectors, audio recording devices disguised as electrical outlets, and motion sensors that would track every movement through the house. The bait is set, she said quietly, checking her watch. Financial documents on your kitchen table, blank power of attorney forms in your desk drawer, and that insurance policy folder position where she'll be sure to see it. I walked slowly through my house, noting the subtle changes that indicated Veronica's previous unauthorized visits. My grandmother's antique desk was gone, of course, replaced with a cheap substitute. Several family photographs were missing from their frames. The pantry door showed fresh scratches around the lock that she'd had installed, but most telling was what I found in my bedroom safe. The lock hadn't been forced, but several items were missing. Backup copies of financial documents, spare credit cards, and the emergency cash I'd always kept for genuine emergencies. Veronica had somehow obtained the combination, probably from Daniel, who was one of only 2 people who knew it. She's been living in my house like it was already hers. I said to Agent Chen, this wasn't just theft, this was psychological warfare. At 12:45 p.m., we left for my fictitious medical appointment. As we drove away, I saw a red BMW turning onto my street from the opposite direction. Veronica was right on schedule. Just as we'd predicted, the command center had been set up in a rented office space 6 blocks away. When Agent Chen and I arrived, the room was buzzing with activity. Multiple screens showed feeds from the surveillance cameras, radio chatter crackled from several stations, and at least a dozen law enforcement personnel monitored various aspects of the operation. Detective Camden looked up as we entered. She's inside, entered through the back door at 12:52 p.m. using a key we didn't know she had. Another lock she had changed, I said, settling into a chair position to watch the main screen. She's been planning this takeover for months. Marcus Rodriguez pointed to one of the monitors. There she is. The image was crystal clear. Veronica moved through my house with the confidence of someone who belonged there, but her actions were anything but innocent. She went directly to my kitchen table and began photographing the financial documents with her phone, taking multiple shots from different angles. That's federal wire fraud, Marcus said with satisfaction. Transmitting images of financial documents without authorization across interstate communications networks. Victoria Sterling was taking notes rapidly. And criminal trespass. Breaking and entering, an invasion of privacy just for starters. But Veronica wasn't finished. We watched as she moved to my living room and began searching through drawers and cabinets with systematic efficiency. She was clearly following a mental checklist, looking for specific items. When she found the blank power of attorney forms exactly where we'd placed them, her face lit up with satisfaction. "What's she doing now?" Agent Chen asked. I leaned forward. Studying Veronica's behavior on screen. She's comparing the blank forms to something else, probably a sample she prepared in advance. Sure enough, Veronica pulled out her phone and opened what appeared to be a document file. She laid the blank form beside her phone screen and began copying text onto the form, carefully forging what looked like my signature at the bottom. "Document forgery," Victoria said. "That's a felony." "Multiple felonies," Marcus corrected. "Forgery, fraud, and conspiracy. But look at this." He pointed to another monitor showing Veronica moving to my home office. She sat down at my desk, opened a laptop we'd positioned there, and began attempting to access financial accounts using password combinations written on a small piece of paper. "How did she get my banking passwords?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Detective Camden was already on his radio. "We need to trace that paper. It could be evidence of previous unauthorized access or identity theft." "She probably got them from Daniel," I said bitterly. "I gave him some of my financial information years ago as an emergency backup. I never imagined he'd share it with his wife for criminal purposes." For 25 minutes, we watched Veronica systematically commit one felony after another. She photographed personal documents, attempted to access financial accounts, forged legal documents, and searched through my personal belongings as if she was cataloging items for removal. But the most damning evidence came when she made a phone call from my kitchen landline. "It's me," she said, and the surveillance audio picked up both sides of the conversation clearly. "I'm in the house now. She's definitely at that doctor's appointment. Just like Daniel said she'd be." "Good," came a voice I didn't recognize. "Did you find what we need?" "Everything's here. Bank account information, insurance policies, even some blank legal forms I can use." "This is going to be easier than we thought. What about the old lady? Is she going to be a problem?" Veronica laughed, and the sound made my blood run cold. "Please. She's 70 years old and just had a massive heart attack. She's probably going to die from the stress of the legal proceedings anyway. And if she doesn't," the pause was meaningful. "Well, heart attack victims often have complications." The room fell silent except for the electronic hum of the surveillance equipment. Everyone had heard the implied threat. "That's conspiracy to commit murder," Marcus said grimly. "We've got everything we need." But Veronica wasn't finished. The most damning moment came when she retrieved something from her car, a small garden spade, and went into my backyard. The surveillance footage showed her digging up something she'd buried near my rose bushes, then immediately burying something else in the same location. "Evidence tampering," Victoria said. "She's replacing whatever she planted before with something new, probably something that supports a more advanced incompetence claim," I said, watching my roses being disturbed by this woman's criminal activity. "Maybe medication bottles with wrong dates, or documents that suggest I was making irrational financial decisions after burying the new evidence." Veronica spent another 15 minutes in my house, this time focusing on my bedroom. She went through my closet, my jewelry box, and even my medicine cabinet, photographing everything with her phone. "She's documenting my entire life," I said, creating a false narrative of decline and incompetence. At 3:15 p.m., Veronica finished her work and prepared to leave, but instead of exiting immediately, she made one crucial error. She called Daniel from my kitchen phone. "It's done," Veronica said. I've got everything we need for the competence hearing, and I've planted the new evidence when they find what's buried in her garden. It will support everything we've been saying about her mental state. Good. Came Daniel's voice through the speakerphone sheet activated, and the financial documents, copied and ready. I've also prepared the power of attorney transfer. Once she's declared incompetent, we can move forward with selling the house and liquidating her assets. What about the insurance? Already handled. The new policy will pay out double if she dies from complications related to the heart attack. And given her age and the stress of the legal proceedings we're about to put her through, the implication hung in the air like a death sentence. How long do you think it will take? Daniel asked. Not long. The stress alone should trigger another cardiac event within a few weeks, and if it doesn't, well, there are ways to ensure that her recovery doesn't go as smoothly as everyone hopes. Marcus Rodriguez was already signaling the rest teams. That's conspiracy to commit murder. We've got everything we need. I stood up slowly. My legs unsteady not from my recovery but from the realization of how close I'd come to being not just robbed, but murdered by my own family. They were planning to kill me, I said quietly. Not if we can help it, Detective Camden said, checking his weapon. Mrs. Walsh, are you ready for this? I thought about everything Veronica had taken. From me, my sense of safety, my trust in my son, my peaceful retirement, my family heirlooms. I thought about her other victims, the elderly people who hadn't had my professional background to protect them, who had died alone in nursing facilities while she profited from their deaths. I've been ready since Thursday, I said. The rest team moved in as Veronica reached her car. The operation was flawlessly executed. Unmarked vehicles blocked her escape routes, agents emerged from concealment points. And within 30 seconds she was surrounded by law enforcement. But I had specifically requested to be the one who actually placed her under arrest. Detective Camden and I approached her car. She sat frozen behind the wheel, her face cycling through confusion, fear, and then recognition as she saw me walking toward her. Veronica Walsh, I said, reaching for the driver's side door with steady hands, you're under arrest for elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder. And about 15 other felonies I'm sure I'm forgetting. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Dorothy, but you're supposed to be at a doctor's appointment. And how are you even walking? You had a heart attack. Funny thing about heart attacks, I said, opening her car door and helping her out with perhaps more force than necessary. They don't automatically make you stupid. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. This is insane, she sputtered as I placed the handcuffs on her wrists, handcuffs that Detective Camden had specially allowed me to use. I was helping you, I was trying to take care of you. By forging legal documents, by stealing my property, by planning to murder me for insurance money? I guided her toward the unmarked FBI vehicle where Marcus Rodriguez was waiting. Veronica, I spent 35 years investigating people exactly like you. Did you really think I wouldn't figure out what you were doing? The color drained from her face. 35 years of what? Insurance fraud investigation. Elder abuse was my specialty. I've put dozens of people like you in prison, and I testified in federal court 43 times. I leaned closer as we reached the vehicle. You picked the wrong target. You're lying, she said desperately. You're just a confused old woman who's upset about being taken care of. I smiled. Agent Rodriguez, would you please show Ms. Walsh my professional credentials? Marcus pulled out a folder and opened it to reveal my retirement certificate, commendations, and a photograph of me receiving an award from the FBI director for assistance in a major fraud case. Veronica's legs gave out, and 2 agents had to support her weight. As federal agents loaded Veronica into the vehicle, a second arrest team was moving in on Daniel. They found him at his office, where he was apparently preparing legal documents related to my supposed incompetence hearing and researching nursing facilities with poor oversight records. The evidence we'd gathered was overwhelming. The surveillance footage, the forged documents, the recorded phone conversations, the planted evidence in my garden, the pattern of previous victims. And most damning of all, the recorded conspiracy to commit murder. But the most satisfying moment came 3 hours later when I sat in the federal building's conference room across from Veronica and her hastily appointed attorney. "Mrs. Walsh," the attorney began, clearly overwhelmed by the scope of the charges, "my client maintains that her actions were motivated by genuine concern for your welfare, your client." I interrupted, sliding a thick folder across the table. "Has been operating a systematic elder exploitation scheme for at least 5 years. She has targeted vulnerable elderly individuals across multiple states, stolen over $500,000 in assets, and is suspected in the questionable deaths of at least 3 previous victims." I opened the folder to reveal photographs, financial records, insurance claims, and death certificates. "This is just the evidence related to her previous crimes?" The evidence related to her attempted exploitation of me fills for additional folders. Veronica's attorney paled as he flipped through the documentation. "Mrs. Walsh, where did you get all this?" "I compiled it," I said simply. "It's what I do. I investigate fraud." Victoria Sterling leaned forward. "Mrs. Walsh, would you please explain to defense counsel what your professional background is?" "Certainly. I spent 35 years as a senior fraud investigator for Meridian Insurance. I specialized in cases involving elder abuse, financial exploitation, and complex fraud schemes. I billed over 800 cases that resulted in more than 200 criminal convictions. I testified as an expert witness in federal court 43 times." I pulled out another folder. "I also consulted on the development of federal guidelines for prosecuting elder exploitation cases, trained FBI agents in fraud detection techniques, and served on the National Elder Rights Task Force for 12 years. The attorney set down the folder with shaking hands. "My client wasn't aware. Your client made the fatal error of assuming that age equals vulnerability," I said. "She thought that someone recovering from a heart attack would be too weak, too confused, or too grateful for help to recognize a professional con artist." Marcus Rodriguez spoke up. "Mr. Patterson, your client didn't just commit fraud against Mrs. Walsh. She committed fraud against a woman who literally wrote the training manual on detecting elder exploitation." The irony would be amusing if the crimes weren't so serious. Over the next hour, we laid out the full scope of the federal case. Veronica's previous victims, the interstate elements that made it a federal crime, the conspiracy charges that implicated Daniel, the attempted murder plot that would add decades to their sentences, and the systematic nature of the criminal enterprise. Furthermore, I said, pulling out yet another folder, we've identified Veronica's complete network. The locksmith who changed my locks was paid in cash and told a false story about my requesting the service. The moving company that removed my furniture was hired under a false name and told they were helping with an estate clearance. The nursing facility she planned to place me in has a history of financial exploitation that she clearly researched in advance. Veronica's attorney looked like he was going to be sick. "Mrs. Walsh, exactly how much evidence do you have?" "Everything," I said simply. "Every phone call, every financial transaction, every forged document, every lie told to create the appearance of my incompetence. I documented it all because that's what investigators do. We build comprehensive cases that leave no room for reasonable doubt." "Mrs. Walsh," Veronica said finally, speaking directly to me for the first time since her arrest, "I never meant for things to go this far. I thought you'd be grateful for the help." I looked at her across the table. This woman who had invaded my home, stolen my property, manipulated my son, planned my death, and destroyed my sense of safety in my own family, and felt nothing but professional satisfaction. "Veronica," I said calmly, "in 35 years of investigating people like you, I learned something important. Predators always claim they were trying to help their victims. They always act surprised when they're caught, and they always underestimate the people they target." I stood up and gathered my papers. "But here's what you didn't understand. I didn't become vulnerable when I had a heart attack. I became dangerous. Because nothing motivates a professional investigator quite like someone trying to destroy their life." 2 weeks later, I sat in my garden on a perfect autumn morning, reading the newspaper coverage of the case. The headlines were everything I could have hoped for. Federal elder fraud ring busted by 70-year-old victim's investigation. Retired fraud investigator turns tables on daughter-in-law's exploitation scheme. Multi-state elder abuse case results. In 47 federal charges, Veronica had pled guilty to 23 felony counts in exchange for a 25-year sentence without possibility of parole. Daniel had negotiated a plea deal for 8 years in exchange for testimony against his wife and cooperation in recovering assets from previous victims. The civil recovery actions had been successful beyond expectations. The other victims' families would receive full restitution, and a new federal task force had been established to investigate similar schemes nationwide. But perhaps most satisfying was the letter I'd received from the National Elder Rights Coalition, asking me to serve as a consultant on developing new protocols for identifying and prosecuting elder exploitation cases. At 70 years old, I was officially out of retirement. As I sat among my roses that afternoon, Bethany stopped by to check on my recovery. She found me organizing case files for my new consulting work. "Mrs. Walsh," she said, settling into the garden chair beside me, "I have to ask. When Veronica first made that comment about letting you rot in the hospital, did you know then that you were going to destroy her?" I thought about it for a moment, remembering that first overheard conversation that had started everything. "Bethany," I said, "I spent 35 years learning that the most dangerous predators are the ones who underestimate their victims." When Veronica said I had no one who cared, she made her first mistake. What was that? She assumed that being alone meant being powerless. But I wasn't alone. I had 35 years of professional relationships, decades of expertise, and a network of colleagues who take elder exploitation personally. I gestured toward the stack of case files on my garden table. Veronica thought she was targeting a helpless old woman. Instead, she targeted someone who'd spent her career hunting people exactly like her. And now she's in federal prison where she belongs. Her other victims are getting justice. Daniel is facing the consequences of his choices. And I'm back to doing what I do best, making sure predators like her don't succeed. As the sun set over my garden that evening, I reflected on the past month. Veronica had intended to steal my independence, my property, and ultimately my life. Instead, she'd reminded me of who I really was and what I was capable of accomplishing. She'd tried to make me a victim. Instead, she'd made me dangerous. And in the end, that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. 6 months after Veronica's sentencing, I stood in the auditorium of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia, looking out at 300 FBI agents, police detectives, and elder services investigators who had come to hear me speak. The irony wasn't lost on me. At 70 years old, I was training people who were young enough to be my grandchildren in techniques I'd developed over 4 decades of fighting fraud. Elder exploitation, I began, clicking to the first slide of my presentation, is not a crime of opportunity, it's a crime of calculation. The perpetrators are not desperate individuals making poor choices, they are professional predators who specifically target vulnerable populations. I clicked to the next slide, which showed Veronica's photograph alongside her criminal timeline. The woman you see here spent 5 years perfecting a systematic approach to elder abuse. She didn't stumble into crime, she engineered it. The audience was riveted. Over the past 6 months, the Veronica Walsh case had become legendary in law enforcement circles, not just because of the scope of the crimes, but because of how it had been solved. How many of you, I asked, would have recognized the warning signs if this woman had targeted someone in your family? A few hands went up, maybe a dozen out of 300. That's exactly the problem, I said. We train law enforcement to recognize obvious signs of abuse, bruises, malnutrition, isolation. But financial predators like Veronica Walsh are experts at appearing helpful, caring, even loving. They don't isolate their victims, they integrate themselves so deeply into the victim's life that removing them seems cruel. I told them about the morning I'd collapsed in my garden. How Veronica had rushed to the hospital with tears in her eyes and flowers in her hands. How she'd spoken to nurses about my declining mental state with such convincing concern that even medical professionals had begun to question my competence. The key to detecting this type of exploitation, I explained, is understanding that it's not about what the perpetrator does, it's about what they know. Veronica knew my financial information, my medical history, my legal documents, and my family dynamics. She didn't steal this information, I gave it to her because she was family. Agent Patricia Moore, a fraud specialist from the Denver field office, raised her hand. Mrs. Walsh, how do we train family members to recognize when their trust is being exploited? You don't, I said, because by the time the exploitation begins, the family dynamics have already been manipulated. Daniel, my son, genuinely believed he was protecting me by supporting Veronica's plans. She had convinced him that my independence was dangerous, that my resistance to help was evidence of cognitive decline. I clicked to a slide showing the psychological manipulation timeline Veronica had used. She spent 3 years gradually undermining my relationship with Daniel. Small comments about my forgetfulness, gentle suggestions that I was becoming frail, expressions of concern about my living alone. By the time she was ready to make her move, Daniel was already convinced that intervention was necessary. Detective Ray Camden, who had driven down from Pinewood to attend the training, spoke up from the back of the room. Mrs. Walsh, what advice would you give to investigators who encounter 6 months after Veronica's sentencing? I stood in the auditorium of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia, looking out at 300 FBI agents, police detectives, and elder services investigators who had come to hear me speak. The irony wasn't lost on me. At 70 years old, I was training people who were young enough to be my grandchildren in techniques I'd developed over 4 decades of fighting fraud. Elder exploitation, I began, clicking to the first slide of my presentation, is not a crime of opportunity, it's a crime of calculation. The perpetrators are not desperate individuals making poor choices, they are professional predators who specifically target vulnerable populations. I clicked to the next slide, which showed Veronica's photograph alongside her criminal timeline. The woman you see here spent 5 years perfecting a systematic approach to elder abuse. She didn't stumble into crime, she engineered it. The audience was riveted. Over the past 6 months, the Veronica Walsh case had become legendary in law enforcement circles, not just because of the scope of the crimes, but because of how it had been solved. How many of you, I asked, would have recognized the warning signs if this woman had targeted someone in your family? A few hands went up, maybe a dozen out of 300. That's exactly the problem, I said. We train law enforcement to recognize obvious signs of abuse, bruises, malnutrition, isolation. But financial predators like Veronica Walsh are experts at appearing helpful, caring, even loving. They don't isolate their victims, they integrate themselves so deeply into the victim's life that removing them seems cruel. I told them about the morning I'd collapsed in my garden. How Veronica had rushed to the hospital with tears in her eyes and flowers in her hands. How she'd spoken to nurses about my declining mental state with such convincing concern that even medical professionals had begun to question my competence. The key to detecting this type of exploitation, I explained, is understanding that it's not about what the perpetrator does, it's about what they know. Veronica knew my financial information, my medical history, my legal documents, and my family dynamics. She didn't steal this information, I gave it to her because she was family. Agent Patricia Moore, a fraud specialist from the Denver field office, raised her hand. Mrs. Walsh, how do we train family members to recognize when their trust is being exploited? You don't, I said, because by the time the exploitation begins, the family dynamics have already been manipulated. Daniel, my son, genuinely believed he was protecting me by supporting Veronica's plans. She had convinced him that my independence was dangerous, that my resistance to help was evidence of cognitive decline. I clicked to a slide showing the psychological manipulation timeline Veronica had used. She spent 3 years gradually undermining my relationship with Daniel. Small comments about my forgetfulness, Gentle suggestions that I was becoming frail, expressions of concern about my living alone. By the time she was ready to make her move, Daniel was already convinced that intervention was necessary. Detective Ray Camden, who had driven down from Pinewood to attend the training, spoke up from the back of the room. "Mrs. Walsh, what advice would you give to investigators who encounter elderly victims who insist they're being helped, not exploited?" "Document everything," I said immediately. "These cases are won and lost on documentation." When I was investigating Veronica, I didn't rely on my memory or my impressions. I recorded phone calls, photographed documents, maintained detailed logs of every interaction. I told them about Mrs. Henderson's security camera footage, about Bethany's medical documentation, about the careful paper trail we'd built that left no room for alternative interpretations. But most importantly, I continued, remember that competence and vulnerability are not mutually exclusive. I was vulnerable. I'd just had a heart attack. I was physically weakened. I was emotionally dependent on family support, but I was also competent. I understood what was happening to me. I could make rational decisions about my care, and I had the skills to fight back. The questions continued for over an hour. How do you distinguish between legitimate family concern and manipulative control? How do you investigate when the alleged perpetrator has legal authority? How do you build cases when the victims are reluctant to cooperate? But the most important question came from Agent Sarah Kim, a young investigator from the Los Angeles field office. "Mrs. Walsh," she said, "your case has become a model for elder fraud prosecution nationwide. But what about the elderly people who don't have your professional background? How do we protect the victims who can't protect themselves?" I smiled, because this was exactly the question I'd been hoping someone would ask. "That's why I'm here," I said, "not just to train you, but to build something lasting." I clicked to my final slide, which showed the logo for the Dorothy Walsh Institute for Elder Protection, a new organization I'd founded. It's the civil recovery money from Veronica's prosecution. Every case we solve teaches us something new about how these predators operate. Every successful prosecution creates precedent for future cases. Every elderly person who fights back and wins makes it harder for the next predator to succeed. After the presentation, I was approached by dozens of investigators who wanted to discuss specific cases. But the conversation that meant the most to me came from Agent Marcus Rodriguez, who had become something of a mentor in my new career. "Dorothy," he said as we walked toward the parking lot, "I've been thinking about something you said in there, about competence and vulnerability not being mutually exclusive. What about it? I think that's the key insight that's going to change how we approach these cases. For too long, we've operated under the assumption that elderly victims need protection from their own poor judgment. But your case proves that elderly victims can be the best investigators of their own exploitation." He was right. Over the past 6 months, I'd consulted on 17 different elder fraud cases across 12 states. In every single case, the victim had suspected something was wrong long before law enforcement got involved. "Do you think he really understood what Veronica was planning?" Bethany asked. "I think he understood enough," I said. "He knew she was stealing from me. He knew she was forging documents. He knew she was planning to have me declared incompetent. Whether he fully understood the murder plot or just chose not to think about it too hard, I'm not sure it matters." Detective Linda Martinez appeared at my garden gate, as she did most Sunday afternoons now. Over the past 9 months, she'd become not just a professional colleague but a genuine friend. "Ladies," she said, settling into the third chair around my garden table, "I bring news from the world of law enforcement." "Good news or bad news?" I asked. "Mostly good. The Veronica Walsh protocols have been adopted by police departments in 43 states. Elder fraud prosecutions are up 37% nationally, and the FBI has reported a significant increase in successful prosecutions of complex exploitation schemes. What's the bad news? The predators are adapting. We're seeing more sophisticated schemes, better documentation, more careful legal maneuvering. They're learning from Veronica's mistakes." Bethany looked concerned. "Does that mean what we're doing isn't working?" "On the contrary," Linda said. It means it's working so well that the criminals are having to work harder to succeed. That's a good problem to have. She pulled out a folder and showed us photographs from a recent case in Oregon. This couple was using almost exactly the same playbook Veronica used: medical crisis, family intervention, gradual isolation, forged documents. But the victim's daughter had heard about your case, recognized the warning signs, and called us before any money changed hands. Prevention instead of prosecution, I said with satisfaction. That's the goal. As the afternoon wore on, we discussed new cases, reviewed training materials, and planned the next phase of the Institute's expansion. But the conversation that stayed with me came just as Linda was preparing to leave. Dorothy, she said, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you regret any of it? The publicity, the speaking engagements, becoming the face of a national movement. You could have just taken your settlement money and lived quietly. I thought about her question as I looked around my garden. The roses were thriving. Mrs. Henderson still waved from her window every morning, and my house felt like home again. But it was a different kind of peace than I'd had before, not the peace of retirement, but the peace of purpose. Linda, I said, for 5 years after I retired, I felt like I was waiting to die. Not actively, not morbidly, but there was this sense that the important part of my life was over, that I was just filling time until the end. And now, I wake up every morning knowing that what I do matters. Every case we solve, every predator we catch, every victim we help, it means that someone's grandmother isn't going to die alone in a nursing home while her family profits from her death. Bethany smiled. You've saved a lot of lives, Dorothy. We've saved a lot of lives, I corrected. None of this would have been possible without the network of people who refused to let Veronica succeed. You, Linda, Detective Camden, Marcus Rodriguez, Victoria Sterling, Mrs. Henderson, even Jennifer Morrison, my attorney. Everyone who believed that a 70-year-old woman could fight back and win. As evening settled over my garden, I reflected on the letter I'd received that morning from Robert Chen, the retired teacher in Arizona whose case had been one of our early successes. Mrs. Walsh, he'd written, I wanted you to know that my great-granddaughter started college this week on a scholarship funded by the money we recovered from my daughter-in-law's theft. She's studying criminal justice because she says she wants to fight for people who can't fight for themselves. She says you're her hero. That letter was sitting on my desk inside, along with dozens of others from victims, family members, and law enforcement professionals whose lives had been touched by what we were building. But perhaps the most meaningful correspondence had come from an unexpected source: Sandra Kellerman, the elder services worker who had initially been sent to evaluate my competence. Mrs. Walsh, she'd written, your case fundamentally changed how our department approaches elder welfare investigations. We now require corroborating evidence before accepting family reports of cognitive decline, and we've implemented protocols for identifying potential exploitation scenarios. I estimate that these changes have prevented dozens of unnecessary interventions and identified several cases of actual abuse that might otherwise have gone undetected. As I sat in my garden that evening, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky, I thought about Veronica in her federal prison cell. I wondered if she understood the magnitude of what her greed had unleashed, not just her own downfall, but the creation of a national movement that was making it exponentially harder for people like her to succeed. I thought about the elderly, victims who would never be exploited because their families now knew the warning signs. I thought about the predators who would think twice before targeting vulnerable seniors because they knew the consequences were severe and certain. I thought about the law enforcement professionals who were better equipped to investigate these crimes because they understood how sophisticated financial predators really were. But mostly, I thought about the message we'd sent to anyone who assumed that age equaled vulnerability. Some elderly people had spent their careers hunting predators, and retirement didn't make them defenseless, it made them dangerous. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Rodriguez. Dorothy, new case in Florida. 90-year-old former federal judge being exploited by his nephew. Victim is sharp, suspicious, and asking specifically for Dorothy Walsh Institute assistance. Can we take it? I smiled and typed back, absolutely. Some people never learn that you don't con the people who wrote the rules, as I prepared to go inside for the evening. I took one last look around my garden. The roses Charles had planted were thriving. Mrs. Henderson's security camera was still faithfully recording everything that happened on our quiet street. And my house stood solid and secure not just because of better locks and alarm systems, but because it was protected by something far more powerful than technology. It was protected by the knowledge that its owner was not a victim waiting to happen, but a professional investigator who had turned her own exploitation into a weapon for protecting others. Veronica had tried to steal my life. Instead, she'd given me a new purpose, and at 70 years old, I was just getting started. Dorothy Walsh went on to consult on over 200 elder fraud cases and established protocols that are now used by law enforcement agencies nationwide. The Dorothy Walsh Institute for Elder Protection has helped recover more than $15 million in stolen assets and prevented countless cases of exploitation through education and early intervention. Veronica Walsh was denied parole and remains in federal prison. Daniel Walsh was released after serving 6 years and now works as a paralegal specializing in elder law on the prosecution side. Mrs. Henderson's security camera footage is still used in FBI training seminars as an example of how community awareness can provide crucial evidence in elder exploitation cases. And the roses in Dorothy's garden continue to bloom every spring, tended by someone who proved that some people become more dangerous, not more vulnerable, with age. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.